What's up, sports fans? My name is lukasweese, host of the Weesesports Chronicles podcast. We got a great episode for you today with Arpon Basu. He is the editor-in-chief of the Athletic Montreal and Athletic Montreal, covering the Montreal Canadiens. In this episode, I chat with Arpon about covering the strange Stanley Cup Playoffs, the possibility of covering an all-Canadian division in the upcoming season, as well as his sports media career working for NHL.com, moving over to the Athletic, the challenges of working for a digital operation early on that's now become entrenched into sports media. And then we end off with a conversation about his work as the inclusion co-chair of the Professional Hockey Writers Association and his efforts to increase diversity in hockey media and hockey coverage. So it's a really great conversation with Arpan Basu on the Weesesports Chronicles podcast. If you have not yet subscribed to the pod, you can through YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. So make sure to like, rate, watch, and subscribe to all three of those channels. Now let's get to today's episode with Arpan Basu on the Weesports Chronicles podcast. All right, as I said off the top, I am pleased to be joined by Arpan Basu. Arpan is the editor-in-chief of the Athletic Montreal and Athletic Montreal. He previously worked for the NHL for 6 years as a managing editor for LNH.com and a contributing writer for NHL.com. He joins me on the Weesports Chronicles podcast. Arpan, thanks so much for coming on.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, man.
Likewise, and we'll get into your career in just a bit, but as we're recording this episode now, still no official word on when the NHL season is going to start. Obviously, Commissioner Gary Bettman wants January 1st, but the big rumor, Arpan, of course, is an all-Canadian division. I just want your thoughts, just as a journalist, just how exciting that possibility can be covering that all-Canadian division.
Yeah, I think it would be great. It would perhaps stoke some rivalries. That it's unfortunate. I feel for the people in Western Canada. The Canadians and the Maple Leafs both draw so well in Western Canada, and they only get them once a year. So if this were to happen, it would be, God knows how the schedule would work, but it would be 12, 15 times. I don't know how many times it would be, but. So that would be exciting, and it would be cool to see the atmosphere in those buildings and how it would change if it wasn't just one game. Because the Canadians show up, and it's the same for the Leafs, but the Canadians will show up in Calgary, and there'll be 6,000 Canadians fans or whatever. But if it's that's one game a year. If it were 12 games, I think that split would be a little different, and probably the Calgary fans could take over their own building again. And I'm also most intrigued by the whole baseball style schedule that seems to be floating around. As a reporter, that would be really, really interesting, because they would almost be like mini playoff series throughout the season, like basically mini 2 or 3 game playoff series. You'd have some animosity, you'd have some storylines that would develop, the stuff we see in the playoffs, but in the regular season. I think that would be really interesting. And I think it's something the NHL should actually consider further from this pandemic. It just makes sense in terms of their carbon footprint, travel costs, everything about it makes a lot of sense. And I just hope that they take this as sort of a test case and see how compelling these miniseries are, if indeed that's what they do. Because I think it would be really cool. In the middle of at the beginning of the season, or in the middle of the season, suddenly, in the first game, there's let's say a fight between 2 guys, and then they have to play again 2 nights later, and all the repercussions of that we only see in the playoffs. I think it would be cool to experiment with trying to recreate a little bit of that in the regular season.
I definitely agree, and I think also it could even, obviously Leafs Canadians is a rivalry that will never grow old, but I think it could even strengthen that rivalry. Because they haven't met in the playoffs for so many years.
Yeah, it's not really a rivalry anymore.
No, and
it's
actually,
like an event.
Yeah,
it's an event more than a rivalry.
Yeah. Well, that's what I've always.
Really a rivalry.
Yeah, I've always sort of said that to people that my parents who are hockey fans, or any of my friends, colleagues. My my dad grew up in, the Leafs Canadians back in the 60s when it was an actual rivalry when they were competing for a Stanley Cup. And I just sort of want
Mhm.
that rivalry to be reignited again because it just hasn't been there the last few years.
Yeah, and I think this can maybe create that a little bit. And I mean, Leafs Habs games are always heated, and every player on either team understands the importance of them. They're always on Hockey Night in Canada, and most players get up for any game on Hockey Night in Canada anyhow. But if it's a true national game, usually the country is split between the Leafs and the Canadians on Saturday night. So that, kind of unites the country into one game, and everyone understands the stage that they're on. But the level of animosity between the two franchises is pretty minimal. I mean, other than the fact that they face each other on this national stage, uh, you know, 5 or 6 times a year. So it's yeah, I think, and I mean, Calgary, Edmonton playing 12 or 13 times, Vancouver, Calgary, with all the Canucks who've signed with the Flames of the off season. Like, there's lots of possibilities. And back in the day, Ottawa Montreal was a pretty good simmering rivalry for a little while there. So um, I think there's a lot of possibilities. And listen, it's obviously it's all predicated on necessity, right? The Canadian border with the U.S. is not going to open anytime soon. If they want to play hockey, they need to make some practical decisions. This is just seems like it seems like it would be a nice byproduct of what will be a very unfortunate situation, in the sense that for the NHL to have a season, this is probably something that they just, in practical terms, just has to do. It's just a nice bonus that it'd be super cool. That
Yeah.
it'll be just this fun one season. It'll make this season a lot more fun, I feel. Aside from the fact that it's going to bring, assuming that they can ever get it off the ground, it'll bring a much needed distraction to a lot of people who have been dealing with a lot of things in their lives over the last 6 months, and probably for the next 6 months, that haven't been a whole lot of fun. So, I mean, it's the importance of getting this NHL season off the ground, I think, lies in that, giving people a bit of joy. Like we saw in the playoffs, I think everyone got into it, and it was a welcome distraction for a lot of people. And on top of that, if we could start experimenting with some new formats and some new gimmicks that the NHL can maybe incorporate long term, then why not? Then let's get another positive out of this.
Speaking of the playoffs, you had the chance to cover the Stanley Cup playoffs in the bubble. I mean, you obviously saw the Montreal Canadiens in Toronto, and then you and your colleague Thomas Durant covered the remainder in Edmonton. I'm just curious, as a reporter and a journalist who's probably who's done a lot and done a lot throughout your career, what was that challenge like
Mm.
for you to be able to report on this sort of once in a lifetime unprecedented event?
Well, actually, I'm just gonna. I actually didn't go to Toronto, so that's why I got
Okay.
the taste of both. I got a taste of both things, both ways of doing it. So I covered the Canadians from home because we didn't see a benefit to me being there for in terms of availability and everything. We had a lot of people, and we have a lot of people in Toronto at the Athletic, obviously. So all the kind of side stuff, about the atmosphere and everything. So that was a challenge. That was the first time I'd ever covered my team virtually, like through Zoom calls. And so you had to really look for, you had to think really hard on your angle every night and try and really sort of think outside the box and think bigger picture. And so that was tough because I do a lot of my writing off games and off practices is based on, it's based on stuff I get in the room, and it's based on conversations I have with guys, usually off to the side or by myself, where I try as much as I can. So that was different. And then they asked me to go to Edmonton. Thomas was in Edmonton from day one, from
Hmm.
exhibition games to the very end. The guy was a machine. So at some point he was gonna die. He
Yeah.
needed help. So I got flown in, and that was interesting. Getting on a plane was interesting.
Mm.
Um, and being in the bubble, and not even in the bubble. Like we like to refer to ourselves as bubble adjacent in Edmonton, in the sense that we were in the building, but we were not allowed anywhere except for the press level, which was not the regular press level, but it was basically the second level concourse. And they had us all set up in seats, properly distanced, and we had to wear masks. And but the first game I saw, um, was pretty wild. I was really excited to see a live hockey game. And Thomas had been there for months and he was burnt out. He dealt with the Canucks run up to that point. And he's, obviously normally our Canucks beat writer. So he was exhausted. And this was all old to him. And I show up and I'm like, oh my God, live hockey. This is amazing. I'm loving this. So, he finally gave him he said he gave him a little boost of energy because he remembered that, we're actually one of the privileged few who get to watch this live. And, it's funny. It didn't take that long to get used to it. I would say like 3 or 4 games in and you're pretty much used to it. Like it's obviously the one thing that jumps out immediately is the fact that you can hear a lot of what's going on the ice, especially with like post whistle scrums and stuff like that. And guys kind of barking at each other back and forth. But it became normal really quickly. I was surprised at how normal it felt and how soon it felt that normal, and when you talk to the players and the coaches, like, any question they got about being in an empty arena, I wrote a story on each of the conference championship trophies being presented in an empty rink, the cup being presented in an empty rink, and every question they got on it, they're like, we didn't even notice it was empty. Like they totally blocked it out. And I get it. Cause I'd say a week into it, that's how I felt watching these games. It just felt normal all of a sudden. Cause with the product on the ice was the same. The only thing missing was the crowd noise. And so, but I got to say, I'm looking forward to the day where we can get that crowd noise back again. It really adds an element that was missing during those playoffs for sure. I mean, the noise and the atmosphere and the home ice intimidation factor in the playoffs was really something that was lacking.
Yeah, and like, you mentioned just how, obviously, you get used to the Zoom press conferences, but in talking with other reporters who've, covered different sports and bubbles and using Zoom as the vehicle to try to help their stories, I mean, I think they've all sort of admitted just that, you missing that one-on-one interaction with players or coaches and getting a player walking off the podium or in the dressing room can really hinder the storytelling process. Did you feel that, or did you think that the relationships that you've built throughout your career assisted you in a way to be able to tell stories in this environment?
Well, yes. Yes. I mean, my experience assisted me in storytelling because, I'm generally not as reliant on quotes to write my stories in general. So it's not, but having said that, I do rely on conversations with players. Less so coaches. It's very rare that I'll get Claude Julien by himself. He is always in a press conference setting, but in the dressing room, I tend to kind of just float around and hover towards guys who are by themselves and sort of get their insights and have a conversation more so than an interview. It's how I like to do things. So that was obviously taken away. And the guys on the team that I had relationships with or who are like relatively friendly with me, like it's hard to joke around on Zoom. They couldn't even see me, I could see them, but we were just like this voice of God coming down in this room, And so it's like, it's kind of awkward and it didn't really make for, it was hard to like ask nuanced questions. Like if you want to ask a difficult question, it was hard to lead into it and soften it a little bit so that it doesn't come off as being just very abrupt and harsh. So there's a way to do that when you're in person with someone and you're by themselves and you can say, listen, I understand all the factors that go into it, but you messed up on this shift and it wound up with a goal against what happened there kind of thing. It's a lot easier to do that face to face where the guy knows you're not out to get him. You're just reporting on what happened and that's what happened. And most guys are pretty good with that. So I'm a guy who tries to avoid scrums in the room in normal times. And so the Zoom thing was just one long scrum for months. So it made it more difficult, but it definitely, I found it interesting as a thought experiment and as a writing challenge and as a way to develop it as a writer. Like I thought I got better as a writer over the course of that period. Like I really do. It forced me to think in different ways. It forced me to, not take the low hanging fruit, like try and really dig deep into something that everyone's writing about so that you can come up with something that's a little bit different or a little bit better. So I actually valued that whole experience. I think I improved as a writer.
I want to follow up on your point about avoiding scrums because I find that very interesting because I think for a lot of young journalists who get assigned to a team for the first time to beat, I mean, they just, they're getting used to that whole process. And, I remember my first press conference, I remember my first scrum, and it's like, asking that first question, was
Yeah.
nerve-wracking but exciting at the same time. But I feel like the experienced journalists are the ones like yourself that sort of, after a while, say to themselves, well, the scrum, the press conference, it doesn't really provide the real important, impactful quote to necessarily tell a compelling story. Do you agree with that? Like that, for you that some of your best stories like were away from the cameras and just talking with people and having a natural conversation.
I mean, I definitely do agree with that, but that's a stage that I've reached in my career, and I don't think what that requires. There's a few things that you can gain from being in scrums, and just a you need to listen, and you need to find out what makes these guys ticks, and every hockey player or every professional athlete is different, but there's a certain way that there are certain patterns of behavior that are common to many of them that you need to observe how they respond to different questions, how questions are worded, and how it's going to make them react, and what have you. There's a lot of behavioral observation that needs to be done before you can feel comfortable enough to sit down next to a guy and have a conversation with him. I mean, that's really, the first challenge as a young reporter for myself. The first time I walked into the Canadiens dressing room, I was 24 years old. I was just out of university, just out of journalism school, and I couldn't believe I was already in the Canadiens dressing room. Like, this was like 3 or 4 months after I graduated, and so it was intimidating. And I was interviewing Saku Koivu. Saku Koivu was a guy who I loved watching watch play. Like, these are all guys that I watched. Now all of a sudden I'm this professional journalist and I have to treat them objectively, and there's all these rules and this code of conduct. So you got to learn. You got to listen, so I spent like probably the first 2 years of my career just doing a lot of listening and like just figuring out sort of the ebbs and flows of a dressing room and how things work and how guys respond. And eventually, after a while, I learned, and that's okay. First of all, like, let's just be clear. Like, it's okay to just shut up and listen, like I feel like sometimes that gets lost. And people are really eager to prove how much they know. And sometimes it's okay to admit that you don't know everything, and that the people who've done the job for a long time know a fair amount, and that you can learn from them. So that's what I chose. That's the way I chose to go. And eventually you get to a comfort level, and also you reach a status in your own career or your job where you don't have to cover that day's news. Because if you have to cover that day's news, then it's hard to miss a scrum. Like if Carey Price has a knee injury and he's talking, well, you got to be in that scrum, right? Or if it's something less serious, but whatever. If you have to cover the news of the day, there's a lot of people covering the news of the day. You got to be in there. But if you're at a point where you're just going to write a feature, or you're going to write something different or whatever, then that's the perfect opportunity when everyone's at one guy, everyone's covering the news of the day, every other guy in the room is free. So you can go to take your pick and just grab and go sit with someone and talk to them. Obviously, who knows what the setting is going to be in dressing rooms coming out of this, but pre-COVID, that's what I would do. The scrum would form around one person, and I would go in the opposite direction. And then when that scrum left, I would go talk to that person.
No, that's really good advice. And I think for a lot of young journalists, sometimes they want to go to the big story, the big player, and sometimes the best story is the one that, like you said, it isn't surrounded by all the cameras on a given day in the locker room. But you mentioned Arpon. I mean, you're in your mid-20s. You get launched into covering the Montreal Canadiens. I mean, this isn't like covering a team in Everett or Brandon, Manitoba. No offense to them, but I mean, this is the Montreal Canadiens. It's a big market in the NHL. When did you start to sort of, I guess, feel comfortable in being, covering a big market team like that? And how did you, when did you begin to, how did you stand out from a crowd of people and with so much experience and media coverage?
Uh, when did I feel comfortable? I don't know. That's a good question. It took years. It took years to feel fully comfortable. Like I wasn't, let's be clear, I wasn't like full time covering the Canadians. I was a freelancer. I was a stringer for Canadian Press, so I just covered their games. I didn't really go to their practices, so I couldn't really develop relationships with the guys. They only saw me after games. Uh, I did stand out as a non-white male, so I mean that guys tended to remember my face for that reason. But really, I wasn't able to stand out as a journalist until I started writing my own blog. Like I had a full season accreditation with Canadian Press, which I only used to go to games. And I decided at one point, when was that? 2008, I think, or 2007, somewhere around there. So 7 or 8 years into my career, I decided to start writing this blog, and that's where I can write what I thought about the team, opinion, and all this stuff that I couldn't do at CP. At CP, I was writing pretty straightforward stories and the odd feature here and there. So writing that blog and really developing my voice as like a columnist, as an opinion writer, as an analyst, was really my way of differentiating myself. And so I did that for free. Like I don't suggest anyone work for free. Never do that. But at the time, I was kind of stuck in a dead end, and I was spinning my wheels a little bit in my career, and I needed something to give it a jump start. So, I would finish my work with CP, and then after that, after I'd filed, I would write my blog, and it gained a decent following, and people started reading it, and it got like, it got my name out there, and eventually it sort of led to another job, and so yeah, I stopped writing it the day I got hired by the NHL, basically.
So you get hired by the NHL. Obviously, that's a big step forward in your career. What did you learn from all those years at the NHL, and what were some of the inherent challenges in your role? Because I would imagine you may have not been able to go as deep or as far on certain topics because of the fact that you were working for the NHL, if that makes sense.
No, it makes total sense, and it's obvious. I don't think it's quite as restrictive as people assume it to be.
Okay.
But obviously, there were some things that we couldn't really touch on. They discouraged writing about fights, for instance, which I didn't want to write about fights either. But I remember there was one game. I'm sure you remember the opening night that one year when Colton Orr knocked George Parros out in a fight in the first game of the season. I wrote. It was horrifying. Like I was, in the building, it was terrible. Like it was dead quiet. It was really scary. And so I tried to convey all that emotion that I felt in the building and that people felt watching it into my story, and all of it got taken out, And so like, it was really like just a straightforward Colton Orr knocked George Parros in a fight. Parros went to hospital, blah, 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 blah. So, but I learned a ton working for the NHL. I mean, first of all, on many levels. So first of all, working for the NHL allowed me to cover Stanley Cup finals. I covered other teams for the first time. So I would travel to cover, I did a lot of Predators because, PK Subban got traded while I was there. And so like I had a relationship with PK, so they kept sending me to Nashville to cover the Predators and him. And, I went to the Sochi Olympics, which is the highlight of my career. Covered 2 Stanley Cup finals for the first time. Did a lot of things, and also learned, how the NHL kind of works and how they think and how and sort of their side of issues. Like, it was funny, like working for the NHL when something would blow up and the NHL was getting criticized from all sides and like they're just getting bombarded with hatred on social media. It was interesting being inside the walls, kind of like being somewhat privy to the PR discussion and like what's going on that end of things. I wasn't deeply involved, but I was on the periphery of that discussion just because they wanted us to know, as the editor of the French website, I had to know if they're going to make a press release, I need to get it translated into French so we can run it at the same time. And so I'd get a little heads up on some of the news and I just, I gained a lot of respect for their end of the process. I kind of always assumed the NHL was kind of flying by the seat of its pants, but it's actually a super well-run organization. And I met a lot of great people there. One cool thing was I shared an office, or I was in the same office as the NHL schedule maker. Steve Hatzipetrus, who's based in Montreal. And so getting to know him and learning about his job was really interesting, and just the complications of it and everything. The guy constantly had a headache. There was some team complaining about something, and it was just like, so, it was cool. The central registry office was in the Montreal office that I was in, so I got to know a lot of those people. Those are the behind the scenes heroes of the league. Basically, any CBA related question that any assistant GM or anyone in any front office has basically comes into that office. So, every year on trade deadline day, we would have half the office cut off. Like, we would have half of it and they would have half of it, and we weren't allowed in their half. I didn't actually care if they came in my half, but they never would because they were so busy. But so it was cool. It was cool learning a lot of the inside stuff, how trade calls are made, stuff like that. And whenever I had a CBA question, I would just literally walk over to the central registry and be like, hey, can you guys tell me blah, blah, blah? And like off the top of their head, they'd be like, yeah, section this. You just go look this up. And so that was cool. I learned a lot and I met a lot of people. But even just as a writer, that's when I became basically the writer I am now, is during I was there for 6 years. And in those 6 years, I really went from being like a news reporter to more of a writer. And, I'll always be grateful to them for that.
So without revealing all the state secrets, because I feel like this deserves a follow-up, how is the schedule created in the NHL?
Well, there's obviously, what's cool is that in his office, there's the old board that they used to use. So it's this massive wooden board with all these color-coded pegs and everything. And so that's what, back in the day, that's how they did it. Obviously now they use computers. And so it's just this constantly shifting, evolving thing. Like, I don't know how he does it, but based on my conversations, there's just so many factors that go into it. Broadcasters are always talking to him. Building managers in each of the 31 cities are talking to him about concerts that they have scheduled or other sports or whatever, So he has to coordinate with like the NBA, arena football in some of their markets, lacrosse in some of their markets, ice capades, the circus coming into town, like the circus trip the Blackhawks went on every year. They don't anymore, stuff like that, concerts, what have you. So many dates. And you have to make sure that every team plays in each city once and this and that. And so I don't literally know how he does it, but talking to him it's clear it's something I would never want to do, because that's not a job I would ever want. And because he takes a lot of heat from a lot of people all the time, and he never makes everyone happy. There's always someone who's upset with him. And basically, I guess his only response is, I'm going to have to try and get you back next year. Like, sorry, you have 14 backs-to-backs this year. Next year, I'll try to make it 9, like kind of thing. Like he's in a bit of a no-win situation, but he's a really good guy. And he actually has the perfect temperament for that gig because he's pretty chill.
You've been at the Athletic now for over 3 years, and I've had several Athletic writers on this show, and some of them who were there, from the early days, and they just talk about how exciting those early days were, but also a little bit uncertain, just because it's a startup and you don't know whether it's going to succeed or not. I'm just curious what those early days were like for you, Arpan. I mean, being at the Athletic and now seeing it grow and really be etched into the consciousness of sports journalism.
Yeah, well, it was exciting. I mean, I was one of the weird, I was one of the few people at that time. So we're talking about the summer of 2017. I was one of the few people to sign on with the Athletic who actually sort of left a job, and like right around the same time, like Mike Russo came on board, Portsline came on board, Jeremy Rutherford came on board. We were all around the same time, and all those guys left jobs as well. But prior to us, most of the guys the Athletic had hired had just been let go from their jobs. I mean, you look at the first Athletic office in Chicago, John Greenberg had been let go by ESPN, Scott Powers, same deal. And, they were the first city. And the whole idea for the business was basically based on the fact that, the industry is laying off all these people. There's a lot of talented people out there. Let's go get these talented people and let's get their work out. But for me, I was working at the NHL, as I just described. I was very happy there. I had no reason to leave that job. I had a very secure, I was never going to be fired, like ever.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a very secured gig. If I had stayed there and retired there, I would have had a very comfortable pension. I would have led a very happy life. It would have been fine. And so the reason I left was kind of twofold. I was brought in primarily to launch the French website, which I had done. And it was, 6 years into that. At that point, it was basically running on its own, didn't really need me to function. And B, as a writer at the NHL, since my primary function was the French website, and then we hired all these writers, in the 2 years prior to me leaving, our stable of writers went up from, 5 or 6 to like 10 or 12, it doubled basically. So I just saw myself getting lower and lower, like pushed lower and lower down that totem pole, like I didn't see myself getting a lot of good opportunities just because there were so many writers, and those people, their only job was to write, whereas I had another primary job other than writing. So that, combined with how excited they made me about the Athletics business model and the thought of launching something else again, like launching the French website for the NHL, was exciting to me. I'd never done anything like that. It was all consuming. I worked really hard at it. I worked like 70-hour weeks. Some weeks it was really intense. But it was really gratifying when the site started to get some traction and people started to go to it. And so the thought of doing that for this company in Montreal was very exciting to me. And so the combination of me, honestly, getting a little bored with my job at the NHL, and then these people just showing up at that moment with a very exciting opportunity. It was a risk. It was risky, and it was a little unnerving, but it was a risk I was willing to take, and my wife was on board with it as well, which is really cool, because it would have been easy for her to say, we're going to keep the secure, safe job, and you're going to just, shut up and take it. Like, you're just going to deal with your boredom if you're bored. But she didn't do that. She was fully supportive. So it was a good thing. It was a big risk, but it's paid off. It's really, so far so good, I'd say.
No, it certainly has paid off. And I think one of the great things certainly about the NHL vertical at the Athletic is that you have a real nice mix. I mean, you have the experienced writers like yourself and Scott Burnside and Pierre LeBrun, but you also have some of the younger writers like Haley Salvian or Scott Wheeler have really, ascended in the sports media industry. So I think it's for a subscriber like me, taking in all this content, I think it's really nice to have a real diversity in voices and experience in terms of, hockey coverage.
Yeah, that's what I like about it too, and I love collaborating with all these people. Like I'll shoot Haley a question one day on what's going on in Ottawa, and then she'll shoot me some, the other day they acquired Alex Galchenyuk, and she shot me a note. She's like, what can you tell me about Alex Galchenyuk? Like, this is a resource. Like, most people in a newspaper don't have this option. They have sources that they can call and be like, okay, what can you tell me? But there's no one in their company usually that you could just reach out to and be like, give me the 911 on or the 411 on this guy. And so, and I do that all the time with our writers around the network. And so it's a great, support group's a little strong, but there's a strong network of support. I mean, like, it's as a young writer coming into this industry, you have a lot of resources within the company itself where you can reach out and talk to someone and get some help and have a conversation about a situation that you're having trouble handling or a story that you're having trouble with. It's a really great environment for that. And it's refreshing, because newspapers are not newsrooms traditionally were competitive places. The reporters would compete amongst themselves for prominence in the paper. Who's going to get the page one story? Who's going to get this? Who's going to get this story? Whatever. They're on the same team, but they're competing against each other, and you don't really have that so much at the Athletic. I mean, there is probably a little bit of it in terms of national stories and stuff like that, but by and large, we just want everyone to succeed locally where they're based. So, if I don't know, just if Jeremy Rutherford in St. Louis is doing some story, this is actually a good example. So Jeremy Rutherford had spoken to so many guys about this tailor in Montreal. This guy who does suits for like half the NHL. He's got measurements for like coaches, players, everyone. And, I had heard of the place, but, I never thought of doing a story on it. Well, JR decided he's going to do a story on it. And so he reached out to me. He's like, hey, listen, does it bother you if I do this story? It's because it's in Montreal, but I'm going to be in Montreal soon. I wanted to do the story. Do you mind? I was like, no, I don't mind. I wasn't thinking of doing it. I should have thought of doing it. Like, good for you for thinking of it, but I didn't. It's not a problem. And frankly, it was good for me because it went on our Montreal vertical. Our Montreal readers got access to it because he wrote it. It's not just for his St. Louis readers. It goes on to our feed as well, So it's it's just a really collaborative, cool environment that I think is somewhat unprecedented in our media world. The way that our spirit of collaboration, I think, is far greater than a lot of other media outlets, I would think.
One of my favorite pieces that you wrote for The Athletic was a feature that you wrote a little over a year ago on Brendan Gallagher. It's titled, Brendan Gallagher Spent a Lifetime Turning Obstacles into Opportunities. And I think it's a great story to even look back on a year or so later, given, his impact on the Montreal Canadiens in the Stanley Cup Playoffs this year. And I mean, you started the piece with, in BC, talking to a guy named Josh Nichols, who had been a teammate of Brendan's on their PHWA team. So I'm just sort of curious if you could walk the listeners through your process of writing this story and why you decided to start the story with your conversation with Josh.
Yeah, well, so sometime around, I want to say February or March of that year, I sat down with Brendan, and obviously I knew the draft was going to be in Vancouver that year. So I'm like, listen, man, I feel like no one's ever written sort of your story, really gotten down to it and written your story. Would you mind if I visited with you after the draft in Vancouver, and if I stuck around and talked to your family and talked to your friends and stuff like that? He's like, yeah, sure. So that's the starting point, is that you need the player to be on board, So as soon as he was actually, and I asked him, I would remind him once a month. I'd be like, hey, Brendan, remember you told me that I could do that? And at one point I was like, I think it was in towards the end of the season. So in late March, I'm like, okay, I need to book my hotels and stuff. Now I need a firm commitment. So he said yes, and it worked out. So how this works, that story was actually really difficult to write because I had a lot of stuff that did not get into that story. So it began. My first interview for that story was with Vaughn Karpin, who was the scout, the Canadian scout who discovered Brendan Gallagher. He was pretty much the only scout in the NHL. He actually, not pretty much, he literally was the only scout in the NHL to take Brendan Gallagher out for a meal prior to the draft. Other scouts spoke to him, but he was the only one who actually took the time to take him out. And so he was the first interview, and that was a good starting off point because on that same trip, I spoke to the former GM of the Vancouver Giants, who is now an agent who works for the agency that represents Brendan Gallagher. He put me in touch with the Vancouver Giants owner, who told me these other things. And then I went to a workout with Gallagher and met a whole bunch of the guys he works out with. That's where I met Josh Nichols, who told me this story about this ping pong match. And the ping pong match story with the Hulk Hogan belt was, to me, what epitomized Brendan Gallagher. So with all the sea of information that I had gathered, because not only that, then after that, I went to Kelowna for a charity softball game that Josh Georges runs, where Carey Price wasn't Shea Weber, but Brian Giunta was there, who Vaughn Karpin specifically mentioned as a guy who taught him to not underestimate undersized players. So it was perfect. But that ping pong story, sometimes when you hear someone tells you a story or someone tells you a piece of information, and sometimes you just know it. You just know that's my lead. I'm going to lead into this story with this. And so to have this story where Brendan Gallagher, a few days earlier, not years earlier, a few days earlier, got so angry that Josh beat him at ping pong that he offered to put this brand new Hulk Hogan signed WWE Championship belt on the line just so Josh would play him again because he couldn't stand losing to him, to me was just the essence of Brendan Gallagher. And so you want to find something that is the essence of some guy. That's the whole point of that whole exercise. That's why I spent 2 weeks in BC, was to try and get at the essence of the guy. And to me, after everything I'd heard and after everything everyone had spoken to, that really boiled it down. Was him refusing to take a loss in ping pong.
No, that's that's awesome, and I really like that for two reasons. Is one is you really focused, certainly at the start of the story and even throughout the story, on this ping pong match. Like, I mean, when you write a feature on a guy, there's so many things you can focus on, but I really liked how you focused on this one really unique angle, and then took it from there to sort of explain who Brendan Gallagher was, and also too, and this is what younger journalists need to understand, is that this is a story that got published in September, but you're thinking about this story earlier in the years, and you're just sort of going through the year and figuring out different ways to gather the information, and then just before beginning to write the story. So I just find that really interesting. It was just a really well written piece, and it just shows that sometimes stories take a long time to materialize.
And I think a really important part of that story that is important to mention to younger writers, I think, is that story was made 1,000 times better by my editor. I had so much information that I wanted to get everything I had into the story. And when you work so hard reporting a story, it's hard for you to let go of things that you got that you think is good, but that just don't fit the story, and you need an outside voice to tell you that. So that story originally, when I first wrote it, it might have been 6,000 words. It was really, really long. And we have an excellent editor at The Athletic called Mark Wolleman. He lives in Louisiana, but he's excellent at editing long features and deep dive features and really crafting them into something better. And with this, he was just like, okay, man, no offense, but I'm just gonna strike through everything that I think can go. And he struck through almost half the story, 40% of the story. I was like, no, what are you doing? But he was right. And we worked back and forth. There were some things that he struck out that I wanted to keep, and so I did. But a lot of I'd say 80% of the things that he wanted to cut out, he was right. They were completely unnecessary. They did not advance the story. And so the point of writing a story is not to get everything that you reported into the story. It's to write a good story. So if that means leaving something out, so be it. And then you have that in your back pocket. And you know what? When Gallagher signed his extension, I went back to that story, and all the stuff that got cut out, I used it to write another story on his, more than over a year later, 2 years. Oh yeah. Over a year later, I still managed to use that stuff. That was pretty gratifying. I was like, yes, finally, I got my stuff published, that got cut out of the original feature. But it's an important lesson, I think, is that just because you've learned something through the reporting process doesn't mean it absolutely has to go into your story.
I want to end on something that you touched on a bit earlier, and that was, standing out as one of the only non-white journalists in the locker room. And obviously this has been a year where, conversations in hockey about diversity and inclusion have come to the forefront, and rightfully so, certainly the bubble with Matt Dumba. And you're one of the inclusion co-chairs, Arpon, at the PHWA, and I'm just curious. I mean, as we go through, starting another season and whatnot. I mean, how do we keep this conversation continuing through the media and whatnot? And how important is it for white members of the media to continue to amplify these voices?
Yeah, I think it is important. It's important that, and we've seen just in the last week, the Florida Marlins hiring a woman to be their general manager, the Panthers hiring a black man to be their assistant general manager. I mean, these are historic events, that need to be treated as such. And, we're seeing change. To me, the NHL players, the entire Western Conference bubble standing together to do that press conference to state that they're not going to play for 2 days, that was historic stuff. And it's so change is happening, but like from a media perspective, and this is kind of what our inclusion committee is trying to determine is, how do we fix that? How do we fix, representation in the media? The jobs are so scarce, they're so minimal. And really, like, as an organization, the PHWA, like, our only criteria for membership is that you have a full-time job covering hockey. Like, that is, there's no other criteria necessary. Like, that's what membership is given based on that. As long as you have a full-time job and it's covering professional hockey or the NHL, you're a member, you're in. That's it. However, despite that relatively low bar for membership, our membership is predominantly white male. Like, I mean, it's really a massive number compared to all the other minorities, like women, people of color, Black people. I mean, it's just like, it's such a small drop in the bucket compared to the white male. So the conversations that we've started to have on this committee that I'm co-chairing with Ryan Clark, who's my colleague at the Athletic, is largely, our starting point is to figure out, like, why is this happening? Like, why is this the case? What is the issue at the point of, like, at the original point? Like, why is no more diverse, sample of people being hired for these jobs? So, we have a lot of initiatives that we'd like to get off the ground relatively soon. We're just starting our work. I needed some time after the playoffs and everything to sort of, recharge my batteries and everything. But, we've had a number of meetings. We have, like, some different task forces working on different things. And really our goal is to determine why hiring tends to go towards white males, and B, also provide resources to help train, BIPOC journalists, so that they can have the skills and know how to crack the industry. The one thing that we have as an association or as a professional group is we have a lot of expertise. We have a lot of people who know how to write. We have a lot of people who have navigated the ins and outs of this industry for many, many years. So, our hope eventually, once we get sort of properly, is to start providing workshops for young reporters, not unlike yourself, but, people around your age group who are looking to break into the industry, and hopefully to make that group more diverse, so that, after that, maybe we can work with sports editors around the league, where we'll have, like, this pool of people that we've trained, and say, oh, you have an opening? Well, if we can make a couple of suggestions, we have a few people here that we think would be good for that opening, kind of thing, and sort of act as a go-between, jobs come up. So we're really at the starting point of our work, but I'm really excited about some of the ideas that we've had and some of the initiatives that we're working on. But just in basic terms, that's basically kind of our goal at the end, would be to work on those two issues, the hiring issue and also the supply of capable young reporters.
Well, that sounds amazing, Arpon, and certainly, the conversations have been had this year, certainly identifying the problem, but now it's all about, continuing that conversation, but then also ensuring that opportunities are available for, people of color to be able to, be in sports media. And this sort of leads into my last question, which is, what I usually ask of the guests I have on the show, which is, what's one piece of advice that you give right now to a young journalist looking to break into an industry where there are scarce opportunities and it just seems to be getting scarcer by the day?
The one piece of advice is what I gave you earlier, was listen. If you find yourself in an environment that you've always wanted to be in, if you're in the Toronto Raptors dressing room or whatever thing that you dream to do, instead of trying to prove to everyone in the room how smart you are, just sit back and listen a little bit and try to learn from these people, because you might think that you're better than them, but they have a lot of things. They know a lot of things that you're going to need to know in order to succeed. But the main thing that I do suggest to people when they ask is to write. And if writing's your thing, then write. You have the beauty of this era is, on the one hand, it's so much more difficult to get a job in the media, but on the other hand, you have so many tools at your disposal to get your work out there. As I mentioned earlier, me writing my blog, like I did that on Blogspot, like there was a blogger, like the old Blogspot site. It was so easy to set up. It had no images, no nothing. It was literally a blog with just writing on it. And now, with the tools available, you can edit video, there's so many things that you can do online to show how diverse of a skill set that you have. And the more things that you can do well, the more attractive you are to media companies. Like if you're someone who can speak well in a broadcast setting, who can shoot video, edit video, write, and do all these things, these are the people companies are looking for. People who can do everything, like especially television companies today. They want someone who will go out, shoot the story, edit the story, write their own script, and then write an article for their website. So right now, young reporters or young journalists can do that on their own. Their portfolio is this living, breathing, organic thing where they can actually go out and report on stories and have that stuff available, where all you have to do is give someone a link and then it's right there. So, if your thing is broadcast, then practice broadcast. If your thing is writing, then write. Like you'll never get better at it without doing it over and over and over again and making mistakes and correcting. And the other thing I would say is, especially as a writer, always read your own work. Like read it the next day or like a week later, even better. But like go back to it and read it and be like, okay, what could I have done better? Okay, that wasn't as good as it should have been. That was really good. I really like that. And so you can feel good about yourself, but always be reading your own work. And at least that's what I do. And I always find ways that I could have made that story better. So you asked for one, I gave you 3 pieces of advice.
Fantastic. Well, listen, Arpan Basu, he's the editor-in-chief of the Athletic Montreal. Make sure to check out his work on the Athletic. Arpan, a really fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for joining me today on the Weesports Chronicles podcast.
All right. My pleasure, Lucas. Thanks very much.